Hi, and welcome to the 52nd TiddlyWiki Hangout. I'm Jeremy Ruston, the creator of TiddlyWiki, and I'm joined today by Nathan. Hi Nathan, would you like to say hello and where you're from and your connection to TiddlyWiki?
Hello, I'm Nathan Kane. I'm a developer from the United States, and I've been following TiddlyWiki 5 development for quite a while now, and contributing here and there.
Brilliant. Thanks for joining us, Nathan. And Ton, would you like to say hi and where you're from and your involvement with TiddlyWiki?
Hi, I'm Ton Gerner from the Netherlands. I'm a long-time user of TiddlyWiki Classic and about half a year busy with TiddlyWiki 5, making customizations in the layout thing, and made a few guides about it.
Indeed, which have been very popular amongst the rest of the TiddlyWiki community, and you see Ton's stuff on very many people's TiddlyWiki 5s. So today we've got a couple of questions lined up in the Q&A application, both of which are actually from Ton. So I thought we'd run things by taking those questions first, and then I was going to talk briefly about a talk about TiddlyWiki that I gave last week, and then we'll pick up any other questions and topics that crop up while we're here. So let me select the first question, and the question is it possible to use bookmarklets in TiddlyDesktop? And Ton is a very keen user of bookmarklets when he's running TiddlyWiki in a browser. I guess that would be Firefox. Made the interesting comment before that he finds that he didn't use bookmarklets that much with TiddlyWiki Classic, but that he's using them a lot more with TiddlyWiki 5. Is that right, Ton?
Yeah, that's right.
And why is that? Why are the bookmarklets so much more useful in TiddlyWiki 5?
Especially because with my guides, at a certain moment, I did the same you did. If you want to show the source code, it's easy to put it in. So if you change the source code, then it will be there. So I made the bookmarklet just to make to get the source code in.
I see. And so, do you think? I mean, is the important thing about bookmarklets that one can write one oneself? If you see what I mean, is it the ability to customize them?
Yeah, I never did in the past. I didn't know how to do it, but Stefan made a guide at a certain moment.
Yes.
And then I knew how to modify it. I can't make them myself, but I'm just modifying.
So let me screen share, and I'll just run up TiddlyDesktop. We'll just talk a little about how this might be done. So here's TiddlyDesktop on my well, it's just opening my standard build of index.html. And so the issue, so yes, TiddlyDesktop absolutely could support bookmarklets. It would need a user interface for invoking them, and so that might be a toolbar, a bookmark bar. It would also need a user interface for registering the bookmarklets. So in fact, that's a bunch of functionality that's standard browser functionality that we find in, in Firefox and so on. And there's a few other things like that. Like for instance, there's no, well, you can't see that I'm trying to right-click, but there is no right-click menu in TiddlyDesktop, nor is it possible. Well, I suppose actually it might not be meaningful to use the navigation buttons, but basically, it's not possible to download a file, I don't think either, because there's no handling within TiddlyDesktop for that. So we'd need to figure out those UI things. One possible way of simplifying the UI I was thinking about would be the bookmarklets could be within the TiddlyWiki itself. So so to speak, give them a tag, and then write JavaScript, and then by virtue of that tag, the contents of that tiddler might be offered by TiddlyDesktop as a button or a menu item that can be invoked to then run the JavaScript. But really the issue, I think, is that I've not had a whole heap of time to do much work on TiddlyDesktop. It's got to the point where it works, so it's a viable option for people who prefer it over using Firefox. But it's, whilst we're where we are at the moment, which is to say TiddlyWiki 5 still being in beta, and there being a lot to gain by getting it out of beta, that has tended to push TiddlyDesktop further down the stack. So one possible response to that is that TiddlyDesktop is one of the areas where I think it'd be very easy and useful for another developer to join me, and perhaps for over time for that other developer to take over as lead developer. I think I've seen over the years it's relatively straightforward for me to kick off something like TiddlyFox, but it's always going to be hard for me to make the time to put the kind of polish in that would make TiddlyFox, TiddlyDesktop, really compelling as products. But yeah, that's all down to, I guess, whether there's somebody who's a TiddlyDesktop user who's got the necessary JavaScript experience and so on to help.
Maybe you can ask in the group.
I will. Let me make myself a unscreenshot. Let me make myself a note to do just that. And then in a moment we'll turn to it'd be nice if GitHub offered a way to ask this question, because there's quite a lot of people following the project on GitHub, and they're actually, you might think they would be the people who would be, for whom it would be easiest to step up to a kind of co-developer role. But I can't quite think what one would do on GitHub, besides starting, I suppose what one would do is start a ticket with the title co-developer needed, and put a comment and encourage people to reply to that ticket, I suppose. So Ton, I hope that's helpful. It's saying that yes, absolutely, we could extend TiddlyDesktop to do bookmarklets. I would really like to do that, but the issue at the moment, and while we still got TiddlyWiki 5 in beta, is Jeremy bandwidth. Hence the discussion about the potential for a co-developer.
Yeah, but I mainly use Firefox with the standalone version.
Well, what are the tasks for which you prefer TiddlyDesktop?
Sometimes it's nice to have a second instance besides what you are running, not in a separate tab, but just in a separate window. Yeah.
I certainly find that it's useful to have things in separate browsers because, well, in the case of the Mac, I can do a command tab to switch between them. So to me, the keyboard shortcuts for switching tabs are much more awkward than the application switching shortcuts. So by using a blend of Firefox and Chrome, one of my motivations is to then be able to flick with Alt-Tab between things.
Yeah, and you can have the documentation open when you are...
Yeah. Well, one of many things that I'd like to do with TiddlyDesktop is Node WebKit has support for what they call, I think, frameless windows. So, little reminders and so on that are always on top of other windows, which I think would be really interesting, kind of thing that we can't do in a browser, and TiddlyDesktop earns its keep for, well, for everybody's attention, much more the more that it encompasses things that can't be done any other way. Okay, so should we move on? And the second question is also from Ton, and the question is there a chance that the ticket 192, which is extend link widget to link to a filtered list, will be incorporated in the next release? And so, of course, as Ton knows perfectly well, by asking the question, he's laying down a very gentle and very welcome challenge to me to see if I can get it into this next release. So let's just let me once again screen share, and
well, I think it was my first feature request.
Oh, hang on a second. I forgot to put the toolbox on. Right. Sorry. That was me. Sorry. The concern is that somebody's joined, and I can't tell if they're legitimate or not. So I'm just going to ask them a question in the chat window. Thank you, Nathan. Okay, well, look, I'll leave. If you can block that person if necessary, I'll pick up the question again. So it was issue 192. So the idea is that it would be very helpful if one could create links that, when they were clicked, opened a whole bunch of tiddlers. As has been discussed recently on the group, there is a pretty straightforward way to create a button that will replace the current story with some other list of tiddlers. But this is about opening all of these tiddlers alongside the existing ones. So it's like a multiple tiddler navigation. And the second point about it is that the expectation is that you would also be able to drag that link to drag all the tiddlers that are covered by it. Sorry, that are specified in the filter. So that would give people a way, for instance, and if you create plugins and you've got dependencies between plugins, you could create an installation link that would pull in all the individual tiddlers that you need, as well as being able to, for instance, drag a tag pill to drag all of the tiddlers with that tag. So what's your particular use case, Tom?
In many cases, when I'm working on my kites, I click on a tag, say documentation. I want to open all tiddlers tagged with documentation.
Right, okay. And so you do, is it important to you that opening them, do you want that to close the existing tiddlers in the story river, or to leave them open as well?
Well, they can, for me, they can be open as well. But anyway, they will be open at once. And yeah, the same holds for if you have a certain search that you can open all the tiddlers you've searched for.
Yes, yes, that makes sense too. Yes, of course, we can.
Yeah, I was used to it in TiddlyWiki Classic. And yeah, when I started this TiddlyWiki 5, it was one of the first things I missed.
Okay, well, I mean, as it happens, I don't think there's any particular blocks on implementing this, as in You know, some features, some straightforward-looking features, sometimes.
I don't know how
require
much
a bit
work
of-
it is.
No, I think it's pretty straightforward. So yeah, I'll take that under. I'll take that challenge and try to get it in for 5.014.
Would be nice.
Okay, so moving on. The next thing I was going to on screen share for a moment. The next thing I was going to do was to talk briefly about a talk that I gave last week. So on Friday of last week, I was invited by a German software consultancy called InnoQ to speak at one of their internal events. Sadly, it's yet another Jeremy speaking about TiddlyWiki talk that is not, that hasn't been filmed, so there's no record of it. I did what I normally did, spent a bit of time in the run-up to it, you know, trying to prepare for it and refining my presentation. I felt it went really well, and I think that was partly because after the talk I'd given in April, you know, I'd had a chance to refine a bit more what I was trying to say, but also the invitation was very specifically to talk about TiddlyWiki itself, whereas the previous talk I gave in April, because it was at a Node.js meeting, I felt I gave myself the constraint of trying to make it interesting for Node.js developers, which in a way kind of cuts across the TiddlyWiki story part of it, which, you know, has a very clear, for me at any rate, a very clear shape and narrative, and isn't really aimed at Node.js developers, you know, because the whole point of TiddlyWiki is to give powers to people who are, you know, not that not that experienced computer users, and certainly not software developers. So let me once again screen share, and I'll so rather than trying to repeat the talk, I'll just try to kind of explain what I covered. So the title of the talk, Nature of TiddlyWiki, as I say, very much straight down the middle. What is TiddlyWiki? What's it for? All of that kind of thing. The subtitle that you'll see why a bit later in the talk I was so delighted with that phrase that it that it got hoisted to be the subtitle. And if you haven't seen this before, oh, I should be doing this at tiddlywiki.com actually. The slides are available at tiddlywiki.com/talky-talky, and if you click on this little down arrow guy, it jumps between slides. So this is, oh, and I can fashionably go full screen. There you go. So making the point that TiddlyWiki is old. It's been through several iterations already, but I mean, even TiddlyWiki 5 is quite old in that I started it in 2011. This is an old diagram that I dug up that was, I thought at the time I did it, a not terrific attempt to, not terrifically successful attempt to try to depict what TiddlyWiki does in the single file edition. So I've done that with a thonking great concrete metaphor of a filing cabinet, making the point that we load the file, JavaScript executes. When it comes time to save the file, magic happens and the save goes back to the file system. Now, for this audience, the reason there's an experienced software developer group, so it was trying to highlight the thing that's unusual about TiddlyWiki, and of course the subtitle almost contradicts the diagram by mentioning not just the browser edition, but also the fact it runs under Node.js. A straightforward list of features as might be understood by a reasonably technical person, and yeah, don't know. I'd be interested in people's thoughts, whether there's obvious things that I've missed off. And then, as I said, software development audience. So the first thing to explain was how the file saving happens. And this is an extract from the Sever code that's what I sometimes call the HTML5 fallback saver. So this is the behavior. Typically for me, I get this in Chrome, whereas in Firefox, I'm running TiddlyFox. And it's using the HTML5 download attribute to create a link that when clicked, instead of causing a navigation, it causes a download. And that's, as I'm sure you're familiar, there's the trick that TiddlyWiki now uses for saving. The thing I was trying to emphasize to the audience last week was that it's quite a big deal to have moved TiddlyWiki from taking advantage of really quirks with browsers that didn't have a guaranteed long-term future to moving to encompassing an HTML5 way of saving that should work for the foreseeable future. I believe that browser makers, as there are some browser makers, do seem to have concerns about the security implications of the download attribute. So in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the behavior does change over the next decade or what have you. But for a while, at least, I think we're reasonably safe with it. And then besides making the point that if you can trade off the inconvenience of saving with the HTML5 saver by using TiddlyFox or TiddlyDesktop or the specialist app that's on the iPhone, and I could have mentioned the equivalent Android application. Then we went into a demo, which this is the kind of very straight ahead demo that I do of TiddlyWiki. Trying to really show the basics of how tags work, how links work, how you can get stuff into it, how we do the basic HTML5 saving, how we use TiddlyFox to save, and normally do this thing where you do a view source, go and look at the content in the TiddlyWiki file, and then encrypt it, resave it, do another view source to verify that the content is no longer in plain text. And that then led on to showing the task management demo. So this is the task management thing that's already on tiddlywiki.com. I've realized this is quite a nice way of telling the story, because this, to introduce this, we're just saying there is more complicated wiki text. And that is the means by which TiddlyWiki renders its entire user interface in wiki text. We start with this really simple example of task management, and then go into the next part of the demo showing how the same tagging mechanism can be used to make sidebar tabs appear, and tabs appear in the control panel. So I was quite pleased with that flow. That seems like quite a natural progression from just talking about wiki text to talking about something that's actually a really cool feature of TiddlyWiki 5 for me. And then I kind of stopped to try and answer the question, why would you do all of this? So this is an experienced software developer audience. A reaction I've often had in the past is, why would you bother, Jeremy? There are much easier ways of doing what TiddlyWiki is doing that don't take you down such crazy dark corners of browsers and JavaScript. And this is a pitch that we've occasionally discussed here, that I'm motivated by the idea that TiddlyWiki users can work independently. And I think that's really novel, because most webby stuff, if you want to use it independently, means running your own server. But running your own server is a nightmare. Even running something as simple as a WordPress server means keeping on top of patching and all that kind of stuff. So I took a bit more time to explain that, and got good feedback that had registered as something that was distinct and different about TiddlyWiki. And then this slide is something that I'd like to turn into a diagram of some sort, because I don't think it necessarily, I don't think the meaning would jump out at you. It requires a bit of parsing. So there's two propositions, and each proposition is expressed in the same way, trying to say how in TiddlyWiki simultaneously everything is a tiddler, which is the sense in which all items of data that need to be stored by TiddlyWiki broadly are stored as tiddlers. And you'll see in a moment a slide that just lists all the disparate things that are tiddlers. And we've got our rationale for why tiddlers exist, which is about optimizing information for reuse. So this is the idea that I think I would have said here before, that there's no purpose in recording information unless you're going to reuse it. Therefore, when we record information, we may want to optimize it for reuse. And the observation that I've made is if you've got a document, a long sequence of narrative text, it's very hard to reuse chunks of it. Whereas if you structure your content as the smallest possible units, you increase the chances that you can reuse it. And then the second proposition is that simultaneously in TiddlyWiki, everything is wikification. And what that means is that every process that happens within TiddlyWiki is pretty much achieved by reusing what I now call the rendering pipeline that converts wiki text into HTML. And it also gives me an opportunity to say something that, again, is a frequent refrain. The value of wiki text is that it makes linking become part of the punctuation of writing. And I'm aligned with the original hypertext guys to the extent that I'm fascinated by that. So here we talk in a bit more detail about everything being a tiddler and how that covers user data, the modules from which TiddlyWiki is built, the user interface state, the configurations, plugins, test specifications, etc. And it was also where I spoke a little about the relationship between the boot kernel and plugins. And then the rendering pipeline slide, which is in fact improved since the talk in April, and that's because it now shows how one route through the pipeline is that you render to the fake DOM and then you serialize that to static HTML, essentially by doing an inner HTML of the outermost parent node in the fake DOM. So that's now the complete picture. So it's, we've got the cycle going down to the DOM for activities in the browser, and then the straight-through path all the way through to static HTML, which is essentially the same path for when we're doing a save changes in the browser as when we're saving, rendering a, creating a TiddlyWiki HTML file on the server. Then this slide was just leading into a demo of showing the user interface state idea. So the example here is how I can do it here, I guess. If I do that, I modify the state tiddler that controls the appearance of the sidebar, and that, I'll turn it off again. And then talked a little about how all the kind of user interfacey stuff, the tabs and drop downs and so on, are basically built out of those 4 widgets. There's a good deal more widgets than that in TiddlyWiki 5, but those are the key ones to understand from the point of view of building user interfaces. Then a very standard demo that you've seen before of running under Node.js to create a TiddlyWiki and to serve it over HTTP. Then a similar bit about how to create a static site with TiddlyWiki, and so went into the stuff that you're familiar with, showing how in the static versions the links get rewritten so that you link between separate HTML files. And then the service synchronization slide is actually the same as last time, and it's making the point that there's substantial shared infrastructure between the client and the server, and the fact that we can reuse the syncer module is, to me, is the sort of highest expression of that, because that's synchronization is a reasonable model for what's going on both here and here, but they're really quite different situations, quite different environments. And so it's pretty cool that reusing the same module hasn't been too lumpy. And then this we didn't actually talk about in any great detail, but it was just making the point that TiddlyWiki is now a good citizen in terms of a good citizen for software developers as part of the JavaScript ecosystem, and you can use it just as you would other JavaScript products. And it's sort of, so what you can see here is requiring it to kick it off and using it to, in this case, render some wiki text into HTML. Then this was an attempt to just cover a couple of things that, observations that I think, reflections that have been interesting to me over all this time. Starting with the right at the beginning, to say JavaScript was wildly misunderstood in 2004 would be an understatement. People, many people that I worked with, and have worked with for many years, but at that point were still completely convinced that JavaScript was a toy language that wasn't good for anything interesting. Now, I think it's still pretty widely misunderstood, but at least we've grown out of things like jQuery, for instance. The second point was that when I first did TiddlyWiki, it felt to me like the most work and in a way, I guess the biggest achievement of doing it was just making it work on, well, there was three completely different browsers: Firefox, Internet Explorer, and well, it wasn't Chrome to begin with, Safari, and then Chrome, all of which had their own independent paths for saving. But everywhere there was DOM manipulation going on. There was a good deal of browser detection code and so on to cope with browser differences. They haven't gone entirely. We've still got drag and drop, particularly as an area where the browsers have decided to be remarkably inconsistent. This is poorly expressed, but something I'm sure I've said before, that the amazing experience for me is not just to be able to create TiddlyWiki, but to be able to engage with its users and through them better understand their needs and drive the engine of me working on it. And even the oddest interactions, people posting whiny complaints, as happens sometimes, is incredibly valuable to me in terms of understanding what's going on, what people value, what people find frustrating, and so on. And when I think of other work that I've done, in a more commercial vein, you're endlessly second-guessing users. You're always trying to wish and hope that users will behave in the way that you want them to do. But in TiddlyWiki, I don't have any of that. I know exactly what people want TiddlyWiki. Well, I say know exactly. By now, I've got a very good picture, I think, of what people would like TiddlyWiki to be able to do and what they value about it. Then there's a little rant about open source again. I think I say this kind of stuff all the time, but it's worth pointing out to people who don't come from an environment in which open source is common. And what I like about open source is it recognizes this idea that in the beginning of software, we thought it was a branch of engineering. We thought it would be amenable to the same kind of processes that we use to make big engineering projects tractable. And it's turned out that it is not like a branch of engineering. You know, even after all this time, we can't reliably estimate the production of any kind of non-trivial bit of software. But almost by definition, any bit of software or a change in software that's substantial enough to be of interest in a kind of financial sense, we struggle to estimate. And in open source, you know, there's no estimation that happens, and there's certainly very few decisions are taken that hinge upon the reliability of estimates. Similarly, requirements, you know, in the conventional software engineering field, there is implicit this idea that you can do something that will give you a clear picture of the requirements of your users. But I've found that requirements gathering, as it's called, is so difficult. You know, it's typically very asymmetrical. The people with the requirements don't necessarily understand as much about the prospective system and its impact as the people who are gathering the requirements. It's very difficult for people to figure out everything that they want before they've seen something. And it's the opposite of the kind of iterative approach that you see in open source. My other delight with the way that I'm working at the moment on GitHub is this way that the cost of collaborating, if I can put it like that, is pretty much fixed. And most of the collaboration that I do is actually a byproduct of the work that I do, byproduct of performing the work. And that's amazing, is that I think gives rise to the peculiar shape of open source communities, that you've got this, you present this massive surface area for collaboration. When I think of my business life, typically the precursor to any kind of collaboration with another party is some kind of, what's the word, you know, corporate seduction, business seduction, where you try and got business development people or marketing people trying to persuade the other people to collaborate. So there's a cost just in that kind of approach to people. And yeah, I found that can be really frustrating if you've ended up choosing to spend your collaboration dollars or collaboration attention on the wrong partners. Whereas by making collaboration asymmetrical, in other words, I choose to collaborate with everybody, and then anybody can choose to collaborate with me, that's not bound in the same way. And then another sort of quasi-political rant, just pointing out really that as software developers, I think we need to design business models as well. We can, you know, business people will design business models, but we as software people are the people who really understand the costs and shape of software production. And I think we should think of it as being partly our responsibility. And then this, you know, slightly inflammatory thing that in the case of TiddlyWiki, it's to me such an intimate tool that it's not acceptable for it to be owned by somebody else. And I know, you know, lots of people value Evernote, but I just think that having your entire intellectual property, that's not quite the right word, locked up by a company that for many of us operates in a different legal jurisdiction is really problematic. So I think now we're almost at the end, which was to reference some other projects that I consider share ideals and goals with TiddlyWiki. I think I've probably talked about all of these in previous Hangouts. and then a thank you. So, did that make sense, guys? I'm not even sure whether I lost you during that long.
No. It's quite interesting, and especially, and I think Nathan said the same in the chat window, the duality of TiddlyWiki. That was quite good. I haven't seen it expressed in that way before.
No, well, thank you, because that mirrors my excitement as well. I mean, I think, you know, it's fun doing the talk, and it's always fun getting feedback from people, but the coming away from the preparation, having come up with this, yeah, does make me feel very happy. That's a very worthwhile payback for taking the trouble to go and do the talk. So I will try and say draw it or make it into a poster or something, because it's worth giving that idea of, you know, polishing up the presentation a bit.
Yeah, this slide reminded me of a recent interview. I said in chat a recent interview with Stallman. I'll have to dig up the link. It was from a Bitcoin conference. But he was talking about open source software and free software and the difference. And he made an interesting sort of offhand side comment. He said something along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing, he said something along the lines of, open data cannot succeed without free software. And when I saw this slide, it was kind of neat because this slide points out that TiddlyWiki kind of sits at that intersection between an open data tool and a free software tool.
Oh, yes, because another way of it's the data side and the process side, or the data side and the software side. Yes, you're absolutely right. That is nice. And interestingly, I may have mentioned this before, but on Friday this week, I'm taking part in this Indie Tech Summit in Brighton, at which I've got a very short slot. Oh, look, there I am. A very short slot to talk about TiddlyWiki. And one of the other people here is Richard Stallman, who I've not met actually. But when you look at the schedule, you'll see there's plenty of sort of, I mean, it's structured around a series of incredibly short talks, which I think is a great structure. With lots of breaks, discussions, and so on. So hopefully we'll all get a chance to drill each other. And very interesting people. I mean, I won't bother to pick them all out. But oh, and yeah, very excitingly, there's some mainstream journalists. There's this guy from The Guardian, and there was somebody from Sky News, I think. So that's really cool. I mean, one of the great things about Errol, the guy who organizes this, has organized this, is, you know, he's very well connected and very very good at this kind of you know, I'm not sure what the word is, raising awareness and so on. So yeah, cool. It's only a 3-minute demo, but I'm pretty clear on what I want to say, partly because you may have noticed that Jeremy Keith is talking about IndieWeb Camp. I'm not sure if I'm going to be before or after. Oh, there he is at 12:20, I think. Yeah, I think our demos are afterwards. So I think he will have been on, but it's obviously IndieWeb is, again, quite well known, and it's TiddlyWiki. It's quite easy to talk about TiddlyWiki in terms of IndieWeb and how. So if you haven't seen this, the IndieWeb Camp movement, started in San Francisco, is now everywhere. And they have nice developed principles about owning your own data and so on. But one of the things that I don't know if I'll necessarily be able to find the right place, but one of the things that they take as a axiom is that you run your own server, and they have this idea that if you don't run your own server, that you might become an apprentice of somebody who does. So first you need your own personal online identity, get a domain name, and so that I don't have so much of a problem with. But when they get on to running a server, of course, they mean typically they mean an application server. They mean a thing that needs patching, a thing that needs SSL certificates managed. And so to me, the fact that TiddlyWiki can do almost all of the things the IndieWeb camp guys are interested in, in terms of syndication, microformats, and so on, whilst relaxing the requirement to run a full-scale server. That seems to me to be pretty interesting, and it plays to what we see in TiddlyWiki, which is people like Ton, who I think this is fair, Ton, wouldn't describe themselves as software developers. And might be rather put off by the rigmarole and faffle around being a software developer, and yet are able to, with TiddlyWiki, do the kinds of things that would normally require your own server in the webcam fashion. Let me just pick up your... Oh, okay, it's a video interview, so I will line up a fun 7.5 minutes to listen to that later.
It was a good interview. He hit on a broad range of points. So.
I think he's. I mean, I don't know if I've ever actually heard him interviewed, but I've read plenty of interviews with him, and well, you can imagine, he's a man I admire enormously. I mean, not just for, at many levels. I think his way of engaging with the world is pretty refreshing and cool as well.
Oh, and the video of him doing the Soldier Boy dance was just awesome.
That looks like something I might have to... Is that the right video?
Yep.
Okay, I'll come back to that, or should I? Oh, this is that's pretty amazing. I love that he told
every time. It's awesome.
Awesome. Well, I'm happy to have joined another 500,000 people in enjoying that. Very cool. So, Nathan, anything else from you, or indeed Ton? Any other questions or comments?
I did just notice we're at 4,000 commits on the master branch. That's pretty awesome.
Are we indeed? Every so often, I notice what number we're on, and notice that we're coming up to a special number, and then, hey, cool. Like with your car speedometer, I forget to look on the critical days. Well, that's nice. I happened to notice actually when I was looking at this earlier on, it was 709 people had starred it. So that's good that it's all. If we look at I get traffic graphs that obviously aren't publicly available. The repo gets, I'm not sure what that's for. Is that a month maybe? No, it looks like it's 18th of June. Is it 2 weeks then? But I don't know. I mean, you don't really have anything else to measure it against. I'm not quite sure what all that means. But it remains that
Looks like good numbers.
Yeah, I guess. But I still think that is the graph that I'm most proud of that GitHub gives me. But sadly, I don't think I can take any credit for that. That's liable to be Bram or somebody, I imagine. So there was another topic that we could might be interesting to discuss. So this is another thing that I was looking at for 5.014. It cropped up in the groups as wouldn't it be cool? Oh no, in fact, how it cropped up in the groups was a discussion about drag and drop. So you may remember me talking about Simon, the guy who uses a screen reader. And so when we were talking about how you install a plugin by dragging a link from one wiki to another, he explained something, I guess, that might be fairly obvious, that although screen readers do provide support for drag and drop, it's clunky and awkward and not very easy to do. So we were talking about a different workflow that might work better for screen readers. And the idea was, if you could, when you open a Tiddler, perhaps go in here, find a download button that would download the Tiddler as a .tid file. And then on the other wiki, you'd be able to use the normal file upload mechanism to do the import. And I'm assuming that's reasonably well covered by screen readers because it's quite a common interaction. So I started exploring that in a fork. Sorry, not a fork, a branch. That's the right word. Which has a few changes. So the first thing is a new tab in Tiddler info. I haven't given it a caption yet, with the message download file applying to an existing template. So that core template's Tiddler is a template that gives you a Tiddler file. So let me actually close all my tabs for the start. Right. Oh. Sorry, I'm just trying to find that Tiddler. So this is the template that we use to generate TID files. It uses this obscure fields widget that's pretty much purpose designed for this. That you give it a template and then it just stringifies all of the fields of the current Tiddler except the ones mentioned in the exclude list. And in this case, the template is the name of the field, a colon, a space, and then the value, and then a new line. And then we follow that by another new line, which is there, and then the view widget pointing at the text field to actually dump the text of the Tiddler. The problem was at that stage that the rendering the Tiddler works fine, but by the time the TW download file message has been received by the root widget, it's lost the current Tiddler. So I had to make a quick change to pick up the Tiddler title from the event. So the Tiddler title was already being sent by the button widget, but had to pass it through to save wiki. And now the save wiki method, when it does the render Tiddler to generate the text that's going to be saved, it can now optionally, we can pass in the current Tiddler. So that bit works nicely. Then the problem became that the current saver modules are all fixed to save the file with an HTML file extension. And so these hacks that you can see here in these diffs say instead give it a default .tid extension and say to save it as text plain. So now if I run that, you can see that it pretty much functions as we were hoping. So open up this, go to the download, click the download button, get prompted for a TID file, and then if I open that in a text editor, you can see that it is indeed the raw wiki text of the hello there tiddler in a .tid file format. So that's cool, but the problem obviously is these modifications that I had to make here. So what this boils down to is that this, actually let's go and look at the, so the root widget code that I mentioned, this is the handler for the download file message. And the issue is that at the moment, it's only the only parameters that come through with the message is the single parameter param, which is used as the name of the template tiddler, and the name of the current tiddler, which they say is passed by the button widget by default. And what we'd really like to be able to do is also pass a file name and possibly a type. Oh, we've already got something. And the problem is that the button widget that wouldn't have any means of specifying that file name member. So what that means is that to solve this, we need a way for the button widget to pass multiple parameters along with generating the message. And now let me flick over to my notes on this at the moment. So here I'm saying this is a number of messages that would be useful. So with new tiddler, we'd like to be able to template arbitrary fields of the new tiddler, and that would let us, for instance, do the new journal functionality that we lack at the moment. The download file stuff that we've just talked about. Also with navigate, you'll remember me saying I'm very interested in providing multi-column ways of working so that there are two or more story columns on the screen and that the user has control over which story column is used to open which kind of link. So the idea is that you could have one column there was the stuff that you were working on, and the column next to it might be the stuff that you're referring to. And then by scrolling the two story rivers independently, you'd be able to line things up so that you could easily refer to them. Okay, so this is me obviously just thinking aloud here, but this is what I've come up with so far as an interesting proposal. I don't think it's finished, and I don't think this is actionable yet, but it shows you what I'm thinking of. So the idea is that the button widget can, within it, have action widgets. The action widgets would be inert until the button is activated, at which point the button widget would enumerate the action widgets within it, and it would initiate each one in turn. So as it says in the text underneath, an advantage of this approach is that it allows the user to easily line up multiple actions on a button press and to easily control their ordering. You can see some sort of further examples where I'm trying to show how we would do the other actions that are supported by the button widget. So set and pop up are quite easy. The navigate message, when it's sent by the button widget, it adds some additional properties that are quite hard for us to duplicate with that syntax. So if I bring up the button widget, here's the navigate to method. So you may have spotted this before, that there's a bit of kind of duplication really, that there's already a mechanism for sending an arbitrary message when the button is clicked. and that's what we see here with dispatch message. So dispatch message could be used to send the navigate event. The trouble is that you wouldn't then get those fields, and those fields on the navigate event are what enables us to do the zoom in animation. So that's problematical. I'm also very aware that what we've ended up with here is actually quite procedural, to the extent that you wonder whether it might be easier for at least some people to express that kind of logic in JavaScript. But then you'll know from other things I've said that I believe that JavaScript should be scoped off in module tiddlers so that it is easy for us to ensure that the JavaScript is safe. So I'm against making it easy for people within the core, at any rate, to intermingle JavaScript code with Wikitext code. Another possibility is to just come up with a more concise syntax for these. A more concise syntax, such as so what I've done there, which I'm not finished doing yet, but is to put all of those actions in a attribute, that a multi-line attribute. So what I'm suggesting is that then within that attribute, we'd get perhaps one per line, bits of syntax that allow us to express the actions that should be performed, but not as not in widget syntax, in some more straightforward plain text syntax.
One thing that kind of comes to mind looking at this, one thing I've seen a lot in more classical widget frameworks is the notion of attaching some user data to a widget and then providing that user data to event handlers. I'm wondering if we could make this more concise by having an attribute that is a list of actions, and then having some user data field that gets sent to those, sent with the messages, and basically handling this by sort of convention as opposed to a lot of sort of action specific attributes to know and remember.
There's a kind of version of that here in this earlier version, where we've got these additional attributes on the button widget that obviously the dollar prefix is intended to, is used elsewhere in the macro call widget, in fact. But that's to provide a separate namespace for the sort of payload data, so to speak. And then there's a slight question about what you would, that doesn't really, the way I've done it there doesn't really solve the sequencing problem. But yes, I can see the direction you're pointing there. The frustration, I guess, is that we can't that's the only way to attach data to a widget. So it's not something that we can provide a UI for, for instance.
Yeah, I just feel that that sort of a structure for it might be a lot more approachable to non-developers. I think that the more explicit, what you've highlighted there, is certainly going to be more appealing to developer types. But I think that this is meant to be sort of geared at non-developer types.
I worry that a developer would look at that and go, why isn't that JavaScript? And then, as you're saying, for somebody who's not a developer, it just seems very, very complex. And in other places where we've got complex widget syntax, it's generally been possible to imagine using a macro to encapsulate that complexity and make the functionality available more readily. But here, that's not so clear. I mean, we could obviously macroize the whole thing, the entire button, but macros doesn't really give us, well, maybe it does actually, because I suppose, yeah. So in fact, you might end up with a, I'm making a mess of this now, forgive me, but what was I trying to say? That we could, gosh, sorry, the act of copying and pasting blasted whatever ill-formed thought was in my head. What was it though?
About the marker?
Oh yes, that's right. So we can say, you could imagine saying, that kind of thing, couldn't you? That you could still use, yeah, you could still use macros to generate those same widgets and give us an opportunity to provide a simplified syntax whilst making sure that the underlying widget syntax is flexible. But more thought to be done on this. I think it's, I said in the past, I think that this is one of the that I'm aware of. It's one of the larger pieces of re-engineering that we have to do of the Wikitext mechanism, and I'm very pleased that we stand to be able to reuse it in a number of different contexts. But it also means that I'm not really in any great rush. Well, sorry, I am in a rush. I'd like to get this done, but I'd rather get it done right. If you see what I mean. So it's got to be a good solution for all of these use cases before we run with it.
Yeah, it's a great notion. I'd really like to see it happen. I just worry about it being suitable for the right people.
Well, I mean, I think this is an ever-present concern. I mean, so many of the templates, he says, whizzing into them, are really quite ridiculously complicated. Find some, I like the view template. So. And I can kind of rationalize that as being okay, because the alternative is that TiddlyWiki's user interface be written in JavaScript, and therefore anybody who wants to modify the user interface would have to be a JavaScript programmer. So I think the complexity that we see here is, buys us something fairly important. It also actually, I've noticed, it's a bit worse than it needs to be, because of course it could be like that. But what we're talking about here, writing button widgets, using the button widget to download files and to create new tiddlers, that's fairly mainstream stuff.
Yeah, it's not the templates and whatnot. I'm kind of okay with their complexity because it's it's sort of the plumbing of the thing.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, maybe. I mean, I was right at the beginning. I said, or halfway through possibly, that we could turn the whole thing into a macro. And of course, TiddlyWiki Classic. I think is it new journal? Is that what it's called? Right. So I mean, the new journal macro appears not to have any customizability in TiddlyWiki Classic. So it'll always be easy, I guess, to write a macro that does that, regardless of how we ended up resolving, all this complexity.
Sure.
Okay, let me unscreen share. Any other questions, comments, topics that anybody would like to cover? Because let me see what else I've got. The only thing, I don't think I actually made a ticket for it after last week, but I'm still aware that there's that environment variable stuff in TiddlyWiki.info that we spent some time talking about last week. But I think otherwise that's probably my immediate list of things. So I don't know. Maybe we should prepare to close today's call. And yeah, if there's nothing else from anybody else. Okay, so we'll do the normal waving goodbye thing, and then I'll stay on the line for a few minutes. And but before doing that, I should say thank you guys very much, Nathan and Ton. It's been great having you here. Really appreciate you giving up your time. I hope that was useful for you. Much appreciate your questions. And yeah, and both of you, I think, have outstanding tickets with Jeremy that that I must pay attention to over the next few days. But many thanks, and thanks for joining us. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.